today's discussion is all about the Christology among the Nagas of Northeast India, right? So I think
Mhm.
I mean, I've been fascinated by the topic as such, Christology, because of my own research work on the Nagas and basically also on Christianity and then the pre-Christian religion. So I've been very fascinated and interested by this one, even as someone who has uh, grown up from a Christian environment, right? So I've been really interested as to how people understand these things, and I've been really trying to search for someone, right, who have been working, who is working on this area and all. And interestingly, I came across you, and then I found you who is working on this area. So I think I'm quite grateful, and then I believe we'll have a fruitful discussion, right?
Mhm.
So I have some few questions which I want to ask, and ask. It will just go on unfolding slowly, I believe so, with the questions that I bring into the under our discussion um, this evening. So I would like to know something about you and your work. I think that'll be really good to start off the discussion. So I mean. So tell me something about you, your education background, and your work, your PhD work. I think that'll be good. Yeah.
Sure. So I was born in Tamenglong in Manipur, and I
Okay.
I was there till class 6 or something, and then after that our family moved to Shillong. So my education was uh, primarily in Shillong, and I did my BSc in St. Edmund's College, and long time back. And after that, I went for Master of Divinity studies 10 years ago. After which, I was working in a church. I think that's where we actually met one another in as Shillong Baptist Church. So I was working there. I was working with our community, Zilong Christian Fellowship in Shillong as well. And after that, I wanted to do more studies, and I went for Master of Theology at Regent College in Canada. Um, and I was there for almost 2 years, after which I looked for a PhD opening, and I landed here in the University of Edinburgh. So my research is mostly looking at grassroots Christianity, expressions of grassroots Christianity in the Tamenglong area, primarily focus on the Rongmei language, because there are other languages as well, but I'm primarily looking at Rongmei speaking churches and the particular grassroots expressions of Christianity. And I'm looking with a lens of Christology in a way. I'm looking at how the personality of Jesus Christ is understood on a grassroots level and how that affects everything else about their life. So, how Christology affects practice of Christianity, their perspective on politics, perspective on land, on animals, on ecology, so on and so forth. So that's really my topic of research. Um, as far as Christology is concerned, that was my topic for my dissertation for my Master of Theology. So
Okay.
I had a good experience of exploring like Christological
Mm,
debates and all that kind of stuff.
mm,
Though I'm not an expert, but it's something that I'm
yeah.
fairly passionate about as well. So I'm glad to be able to talk
Mm.
about this today.
Yeah, actually, that's quite interesting because I think when we are talking about Christology as such here, and as you also mentioned that you are trying to understand the grassroots
Mhm.
community or the grassroots understanding of the Christianity or Christology as such, I think it's quite important also to go back into the history as such and look at from where it came from and how did people from that time understood and how it has
Mhm.
developed, right? So I think I think let's try to clear up this aspect a bit since you are also interested in Christology and you have also done some studies on these debates and on its philosophical forms and the historical aspect of it. So I think my first question here will be about Jesus, right? Because I think many scholars, as I have noted, have written on how Jesus understood himself. I mean,
Mhm.
these are speculations about Jesus from the historical materials and all which have been available. So I think, according to you, when you did your work and when you dug deeper and all, how do you view or how do you understand this, that as Jesus would understand himself,
Mhm.
right? How did Jesus understand himself? How do you view this, or what is your stand on this one? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a big question because it can sound a bit presumptuous,
Yeah.
to say that we can know the mind of Christ or the mind of God and so understand
Yeah.
how Jesus understood himself. But I think
Mm.
as a Christian as well, within the confessional teaching, the teaching is that we can somewhat, to a certain extent, have a glimpse of how he understood himself, and that is
Yeah.
through the scriptures, right? I mean, within the confessional framework. So we can grapple, we can try to wrestle with these questions. So with that said, I think we will have to rely on the text, the gospel text, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, obviously. And even though some might think that these are confessional texts, and so because of that they are biased, their intention was to prove that so and so Jesus was so and so. At the end of the day, we are kind of stuck with this bias or not. We are stuck with this text. And I'm speaking of bias. I think these days we are realizing, we are learning that a lot of these political texts on political leaders, historical texts, many even of these texts are also filled with bias, political bias and political agenda. And so we manage with whatever we have. And in the case of Jesus Christ, we have the Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so if we look at these texts, and if you ask, how did Jesus understand himself? It's quite interesting because from quite early on, I think if you are
Mm.
familiar with the way the stories of Jesus go, quite early on from his childhood, I think you remember that there was a profound and real understanding of who he was in relation to the God of Israel. And there was a
Mm.
time when he was left in a temple, right? His parents forgot about him, and um, he, when his parents asked him, "Why did you do that?" He said he had to be in his father's house, and whatever that means, right? Theologians will, uh, scholars will tell you what that means, but I think there's a deep sense of understanding that he had of himself, right? And of course, the question remains. Right now, we are looking back at history and trying to understand, but the question of to what extent did Jesus understand himself? Did he understand himself just like we are professing in our Christian religion? Uh, that's very hard to say absolutely. But at the same time, if we look at all the claims that he had of himself, right? He made quite explicit claims about being equal with God, representing the Father. In the book of John, there's the so-called "I am" statements. I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd, so on and so forth, and essentially putting himself on the equal manifestation of the I am God. In the Israelite understanding, I am is reserved only for God, Jehovah, and he's essentially using those terms on himself. And if you look at also he claims to forgive sins, for example, and these are claims that only God can make. And so if we put all these things together, it seems quite likely and obvious that he had some sense of real understanding of himself. And of course, the fact that he was declared as blasphemy, right? Yeah, the religious elites and the political leaders, they crucified him because of blasphemy. And obviously, he
Mm.
was saying something that was more than just irritating. It's something that's
Mm.
blasphemous. There's something that he was saying that is outrageous. And so if we put all this together, I think we get a sense that he had a real self-understanding of who he was as quote unquote son of God, equal with God. I think if we are to read the Gospels in a reductionist way, okay, we pick out just
Mm.
one aspect, then we might be missing out on the whole meaning, the whole thing.
Mm.
But what if
Mm.
we try to understand what Jesus said about himself and weave all of these things in the context of like Old Testament themes, right? And if we weave those self-understanding in the context of the Old Testament themes, a lot of things come up, right? For example, when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, he's not just randomly picking up words. He's usually using a term from the book of Daniel. And in order to understand Jesus' use of Son of Man, we have to go back to Daniel and understand that Daniel was talking about a prophecy that's going to come, eternal kingdom. And so my point is that there's a lot of layers that are being weaved there when Jesus makes claims of himself. And when we actually study these claims and the things that are weaved in that, we find that he had a quite profound understanding, self-understanding of himself. So yeah, to put it in a really short way, that would be how I understand his self-understanding.
Yeah, I think as you have said in the beginning, right, when you were answering the question, it's quite interesting and it's quite important that these questions, the answer to these questions are not easy, and at the same time, the topic itself is very vast. But then I think um, to the people who are listening also, I think it's important that we get certain hints onto these things, right?
Yeah.
So that we dig deeper into it. And I think for me also personally, as an anthropologist, I would like to think that these things, when you talk about text, when you talk about culture, when you talk about history, and when you talk about people's understanding about, I would like to think that these have many layers. I mean, and I think these layers are not easily understood as such, and people from the different layers of their day-to-day life, they embody these things and practice it in their day-to-day life. So I think for me also, I kind of look at it in that way of having different layers. So I think at the same time, as Jesus also had disciples. So it's quite important that there's one thing about God or about their understanding of Jesus Christ, right? Or Jesus' understanding of himself. But then how did I mean the important
Yeah.
thing I believe is that how did the disciples understood Jesus? I think that is for me. I feel like that question is a bit important because it also results in the actions that the disciples took, right? Because of their certain understanding of who Jesus is, they took certain actions. So I think that is where I think my second question will come as to what was the Christological understanding of the disciples, or how did the disciples understand Jesus Christ? Jesus Christ. I think that'll be my second question. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, so just to retract a little bit about Jesus' self-understanding, if we feel a bit nervous to say that there's a certain kind of progression in the way Jesus understood himself, some people find that a bit problematic and hard to agree with that. But what we can agree is that disciples definitely had a progression of understanding. The way they began with is not the way things ended, as far as the understanding of Christ is concerned. So in the beginning, we definitely see that they had their own agenda in even following Jesus, in deciding to follow Jesus. And I think we can say that they had no idea what they're stepping into, when they decide to quote unquote believe in this personality of Jesus. And I think it seems like in the beginning they were expecting a political or a military leadership, a kingdom that Jesus is ushering in. So they talk a lot about the kingdom of God in terms of the political and military sense. And so I think that was their Christology beginning in the beginning. But I think as obviously as it went, and as they kept following Jesus, there's a massive shift that happens, especially with what we call as the death and resurrection of Christ. There's a I think that must have been one of the most traumatic and dramatic event of their life. Like all of their hopes to be shattered in just one day, and in 2 days, complete turnaround when they saw Jesus being raised from the dead. And so I think at this point, suddenly the Christology shifted from whatever it was they had, and now they saw Jesus as resurrected. And again, not to see this in a reductionist way. Oh, this guy raised up from the dead. Not simply like that, but if you put all of these events in the context of the Old Testament, in the context of what was prophesied in the previous the text, what he said, what he did, the experiences that people had. If you put all of this together, there's very compelling argument that's emerging, which is that Christ is really, as he claimed, the Son of God and equal with God. And so again, to be fair, I think even right after resurrection, the Christology of the disciples were quite confused, I think. And for me, in my own view, it was only after the Pentecost in which the Holy Spirit indwelled them that I see a certain kind of confidence in what really is going on. And even still, at that point, we know that they were far from perfect. For example, Peter, after all of this, Peter still had to be rebuked by Paul. We read that in the letter to the Galatians, right? I mean, these are just details that some of our listeners might find unnecessary, but just to emphasize that the understanding of Christology is very in a progression, in a process, and they didn't just wake up and realize and believe in what they believed. They had to go through a journey of understanding who Jesus was and really grasping, what that meant for their life. And I guess for me personally, that's a bit of an encouragement, because if Peter, who hang out with Jesus, right, who lived with him, can who can even he was not absolute about his belief. Absolute in the sense that it's not fixed. He had to journey through it. He had to wrestle and grapple through it. And I think that's the way of the that's how we Christians believe our journey is, that we are grappling with what Paul calls the knowledge of God. So yeah, there's a lot of Christian language there, but I can't help it. I have to use these terms in order to explain what I think.
We need to have certain basic understanding of the Christian terminologies to kind of decipher what we are discussing here. So I think since you have kind of hinted on to the idea of progression of understanding of Christology, I think my next question will hinge on that one, and that is where because since, as you have also said, that the disciples had a progression of understanding of who Jesus was, at the same time, in history over the years, when we look at the literatures also, there were many different understanding of who Jesus Christ was, right? And then later on, in certain phase of time, there came certain consensus, which for sure not everyone agreed with. But then I think there came a consensus where, okay, Christians will believe this about Jesus Christ. So, I mean, historically speaking, what were the different views, and how did kind of like how did time came where there was a consensus on how Christians should look at Jesus Christ, and how others are to be, or other views are to be wrong? I mean, how did that consensus came about, and what were the different views? Uh, le- uh, I think there are two things here. The first one is historical, and another one would be a philosophical thing. A historical in a sense, okay, how did that progression happen? And secondly, philosophical in a sense that, okay, so how this certain views were dispelled and certain a view came about, which people say that, okay, this is the Christian view of it. So I think there are two aspects to the question that I'm kind of asking here. Yeah.
Okay, so just as a brief historical survey, right? If you refer to some of the texts in the Bible, which are recorded in the Bible, such as Philippians chapter 2, that I can think of, uh, Paul writes, Paul includes a poem, a song, which scholars say that is probably a hymn that was sung in the first century, like when he was around, in 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, 60, 80, around that time, basically the first century. And if you look at this text, the poem, the song, it's very what we call very high Christology, in a sense, like it regards Christ quite highly in terms of who he was, and it encompasses the what we might call the standard Christian teaching of who Jesus was, that he was equal with God and he became humble. He was born as a servant and died and rose again. So we see right from the beginning that there was already a perception of Christology that we pretty much agree today. Okay, I mean, going all the way back to the first century. I think eventually from there, as time went on, there were I cannot repeat all of the historical moments, but there was a time when a teaching was flying around, that Jesus, like man and God aspect of Jesus, is separate, and it's almost like a split personality. they're not one, but they are two separate personalities. So in order to refute this kind of teaching, some of the church fathers had to write a letter and do a theological treatise to say that that is wrong. Jesus is both man and God in one perfect unity, so on and so forth. So another teaching came up that Jesus is basically a man, but he was assumed as God, or he was simply adopted as God. Another teaching came up that Jesus is God and not man. So most of the debates had to do with the dual nature of Jesus, man and God. Some people claim that Jesus is God but not man, and he was resurrected as a spiritual being, not as a human being. And so, obviously, besides the theological differences, I have to be clear here that there was also politics involved. There was also cultural contestations that was involved. If you look at the Great Schism of 1065, if I'm not mistaken, there was the politics of East and West, as it is remembered today, where the East and the West split the Great Schism. Even though theology is involved, there's also politics involved in that, right? And so we have to be clear, there's politics involved, there's cultural contestation going on, but we also have to remember that there is definitely theology also going on, that people were serious about protecting the, let's call it the sanctity of the faith that they profess. And we fall into the trap of, again, reductionist reading of history when we say that, these things are all politics, these are big church and big institutions trying to assert their power. That may be so to a certain extent, but we need to remember that they were persons like theologians or priests who were serious and who gave up their life to defend what they think and believe is right. So my point here, a bit haphazard, but my point here that is to say that these different Christological views emerged from all over the place, and most of these creeds that we have, right, Christological creeds, were written down to refute these heresies. A bit harsh word, but that's the word that has stuck through history. So these heresies, and they were written to define and to protect what they believe is correct. So that's really how historically it has happened. Philosophically, again, there's a lot of complexity in this. But as I mentioned, most of these Christological debates had to do with how the human nature and the divine nature of Jesus, how they interact and merge together in the personality of Christ. So that's a summation of 2,000 years of Christological debates.
Yeah. I think as vast as it may be, I think the periphery questions are kind of done, I guess. I mean, we are kind of coming to the heart of the discussion here as of now. And I think the coming to the heart of the discussion, I think the first kind of question will be something like this, where uh, do in the Northeast, and specifically to the people that you're doing your research on, and also to the Nagas as a whole. I mean, the Christianity didn't emerge in Northeast as such, but then these were brought by the missionaries. So these missionaries also had a certain view of Christ, or I mean, they came and preached Christ or Christianity in a certain way. So I think my kind of first question here will be, what was the Christology that the missionaries brought to the Nagas as such? So what was the kind of Christology, and how were the method of dealing with the Nagas, and kind of like trying to help the Nagas understand initially, right? Understand Christ and Christianity. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a complex question, as all of these questions are all complex questions. But as far as what is the Christology that came to the Nagas, to put it in a very blunt and how to say pictorial way, the Jesus that was preached to the Nagas was essentially different, from the Nagas. I think that's probably the first thing. It's different. There's a story that one of our Rongmei historians recorded when one of the first converts among the Rongmei in Tamenglong, Manipur area, when he was when he came to the village, one of the biggest Zilangong villages, and he brought, because they were illiterate, right? They don't understand. There's no need to bring books and all that. Instead, they brought this picture of Jesus, and he took this picture and he came to the center of the village and started telling people about this picture, showing this picture and telling them about Jesus. And apparently, the villagers, they thought that he was a white demon or white devil or something like that, because it looked so different, right? I think the picture was produced by back in the days. It was still within the British Raj, 1910s, 1920s. So it's probably a picture that came from all the way from UK, from London, by the missionaries. Probably portrayed Jesus as a white man in all that contextualization. And so when the villagers see this, they find it very strange, like very different and other. It's very, very different from what they're conscious of. And so they chased this wrong evangelist out, because they thought that he was bringing a white demon into their midst. And I think that that's a good picture, or that's a good metaphor for how Christianity came. It came in a very strange way, um, um, and it was received. Even though it was received, it continued to exist in the imagination of the Nagas as very different from us. And I'm a bit careful to say this, but maybe visualized as with a European white face. And so that seems to be the Christology that came to the Nagas. So for the Nagas, when we talk about anything, we talk in terms of orality. We use oral, we use stories, we use folk songs, and we articulate our culture through dances and art forms and traditions, right? Here, within this new grid of Christianity, it was just books, it was just literary, there's writing, education. These are all different ways. And so with Christ, with Christianity came a completely different way of life, one that had to do with education and literacy, and one that was contrasted against the traditional way of life. I'm still trying to understand what that means as a Christology, but it's very clear that it came as as contrasted from our traditional understanding, traditional way of life. So I didn't really answer your question, but I think that seems to be the dynamic that came to the Nagas. And by the way, the story of Christianity among the Nagas, in the wider Nagas, is very, I wouldn't say it's complex, but it's not simple. For example, some of the tribes have different heritage. For the Rongmeis, our Christianity came from the Kukis. It didn't come from any Western missionaries. Of course, the Kukis got it from British missionaries and so on and so forth, but we don't have any direct connections to any Western Christianity. And that, I think that has some kind of implications as well in the way we understand and study Christianity too. I know that in Nagaland it's American Baptist predominantly, but among the Rongmeis, among the other Zilangong tribes as well, it's a different story. So just wanted to preface that too, and as we try to understand what kind of Christology came to the Nagas.
Yeah, so with the change in context, with the coming of missionaries or the people who, the evangelists and all, with the change in context, it also happened that, even though the image of Christ was brought about by missionaries, which was not, which didn't grew from the soil among the Nagas itself, but then since the image of Christ has come, the image of Christ will be kind of like painted by the people's understanding, right? The perception, their own cultural perception of certain form of deity or certain form of worldview as such. So, there's a certain form of coloring as such, because I'm sure the Nagas as such in general and also in particular do not understand Jesus Christ as how certain Western people might understand, or certain Jewish people might understand. There is certain contextual coloring of Jesus Christ here. So what are those kind of coloring here? This contextual coloring of Jesus Christ, right? Where, okay, this might be certain a different way of understanding of Jesus Christ, which came from the Naga context itself. So, I mean, what are this kind of coloring here? I mean, if you can add something on it.
So I'm not sure if it's necessarily unique to the Nagas, but from my my research work is ongoing, but just to talk a little bit about some of what the things that I'm observing is that in the first place, Christ was received as God of all gods, like the being that is higher than all of the beings that they used to worship. So it's in theological terms, that's often referred to as Christus Victor, like the victorious Christ. So that was the image that was the most compelling, it seems to me, to my observation, in the early days and for the early converts. Of course, eventually things changed. Nobody, if you go and talk to an urban Naga youth in Nagaland or Manipur, they will not talk about. They may not. They may still hold on to that motive, but they may find something else. For example, like, oh, Jesus is a friend to me. He's there for me when I'm lonely. With the times, right, it has evolved. But in the early days, it seems to be the most powerful motif for the Nagas. If I were to answer your question directly, some very interesting coloring or usage of Naga metaphors that I found is from what we call Luzam. Okay, Luzam is like a genre of devotional songs among the Zeliangrong people, many of which were translated from cookies. And some of these songs have amazing metaphors, amazing imagery that's used to express of Jesus. One of my favorite is that when we get to heaven, Jesus will put a shawl on our shoulder. And as a Naga, you understand that completely, right? That's other people may not understand that, but for somebody to come and put a shawl on you is a symbolic, is a gesture of friendship and acceptance into a particular household, and it's a gift kind of motif. And so, I think there are examples of Christians putting forward this kind of metaphors and imagery to express Christ in a very unique and very meaningful way for the Nagas and other tribes as well. But I can't really think of any other right now. But I'm aware of other tribes like Kukis. They have their own terminologies that they use. They're trying to incorporate some of the language or the concepts to express Jesus. I don't want to try to pronounce that word because it's in Kuki and I don't know how to pronounce it. But there are some interesting things going on as well.
Yeah. Previously, in one of the seminar, I've kind of argued, and I have certain positions on certain things, right? Throughout my research, I've kind of come to certain conclusion, and one of the things that I've argued was that the Nagas have a temporal worldview, in a sense that all of their deities or the worldview is all concentrated on the temporal aspect of the reality as such, and does not concern on or does not have much of the concern on the ultimate reality as such. So what happens was that when the very idea of like the God, right, the ultimate God, since you have also mentioned that their initial understanding of Jesus Christ was that the God of all, right? So it was something like that. The very God, the ultimate creator and the sustainer of all, kind of like I'm sure kind of really attracted the Nagas because it kind of like raptured the temporal reality of the Nagas or the worldview of the Nagas as such. So what happens is that there is a kind of also a kind of tension here, the tension here in such that when you say when you talk about Jesus Christ from the history, you say that the most of the discussion were on the human and God aspect of Jesus Christ, right? But then the Nagas do not really discuss about the human, or they are not so much concerned about the human and God aspect of Jesus Christ. Because why? My understanding is because they already had a temporal understanding of the reality as such. So purging the temporal reality and bringing an ultimate God or something like that fixes the God there, right? So they don't have to really debate or discuss about the very human or human nature of God as such. But in our, among the owls, interestingly, there is this figure called the Lijaba. Lijaba is the creator, something like that. So one theologian has written that Lijaba can be compared to Jesus Christ as such, or and something like that. And I think these are certain ways of trying to, let's say, I believe he is trying to do something like this, where he is trying to let the people, the Nagas, try to understand Jesus Christ better from the light of their own pre-Christian understanding, something like that, right? So that is where we kind of talk about the coloring of the Naga's own understanding of Jesus Christ as such. So I think that aspect is quite interesting as such. So theologically, philosophically, and also very much anthropologically, kind of trying to decipher here, right? Um, about the people's understanding of Jesus as such. So how do you, I mean, as a theologian, how do you really see these dynamics in the church and people's everyday life? In the church, because I have noticed that among the in our dialect, we don't have a word for Trinity as such. So we cannot. I mean, we don't have a word for Trinity, right? So there are certain ways of explaining what Jesus Christ is, who Jesus Christ is, and all. So I mean, in everyday people's mind and in church, how does this dynamic plays in, and is there a certain form? I mean, will you say that there the Naga coloring of their understanding of Jesus Christ is kind of wrong, or is that kind of coloring is acceptable to you as a theologian? On and how does this dynamic should go? I mean, because there is also, as we have discussed, a certain contextual understanding of it, right? So there is this. I mean, in Christianity, we say that Jesus Christ should be, or God should be understood in this way. We use the word Trinity, but then among the ours, as I've said, we don't have the word for Trinity, so we try to understand it in a different way. So, how do we really navigate through these dynamics as a theologian, as someone who is doing research on this area? Quote unquote, the authentic Christianity or something like that, right? So, how do we maintain this one as a theologian? Yeah, how do you see this?
Yeah. So I think I'll try to do justice to the question. I think first of all, we have to establish that every formulation of Christological formulation, right, whether it's from Europe or from Nagaland or from Manipur, these are all contextual in the sense that they were written to engage with a certain concern or certain need. Not just as, for example, the Chalcedonian Creed, which is often presented as the sort of least common denominator among, at least among the main denominations of Christianity. The Chalcedonian Creed also arose out of a particular concern, out of a particular context, at a particular historical moment, right? And I think that has to be established first, because I'm thinking even of John, the book of John, John chapter 1, where the logos, the concept of logos, which is essentially a part of a Greek philosophy, that was used to talk about Christ. So to use your word, to your language, to logos was a Greek coloring of Christology. And we don't raise a hue and cry when we talk about logos, even though it's a borrowing of Greek concepts to articulate who Jesus was, right? So in the same way, I think we should have that kind of a same generosity and hospitality towards the conceptual use of Nagas, or for that matter, any people group, as long as there's the ground. I mean, people differ on what is the standard on which we must agree. I have my own views. Other people might have their own view. Some people think that Chalcedonian Creed is the absolute standard, and as long as you're within this, you're fine. You can speculate, you can paint, drawing, you can contextualize. So different people have different standards, but the point being that as long as we meet that standard, whatever standard that is, I think we should honor and be generous about these colorings, cultural colorings of who Christ is. So, in short, I think Nagas should definitely try to articulate our
Mm,
Christ being an important figure in our social landscape.
mm,
We should try to articulate Christ in a meaningful way. And I don't mean by that, I don't mean that we have to, like be nostalgic about our traditional past, or we have to go all the way back and retrieve, hornbills and like those exotic
mm,
stuff. I think that's not what we want. We want to express Christ in a way that's meaningful. Sure, in traditional sense as well, but even in existential sense. How so one of the more exciting things that's going on in our discipline, which is world Christianity, is
mm,
that we are studying how Christ relates to economic impoverishment, for example.
mm,
That would be a useful contextualization, right? The cultural
yeah,
aspect is there, but what about economic impoverishment? What about abuse in the society?
mm,
What about feminism? These are issues that needs contextualizing as far as Christology is concerned. There's issues, not just the cultural traditional aspect, but even the issues. So I think we should encourage and we should participate in trying our best to color our Christology with meaningful imageries or meaningful words, meaningful motifs and metaphors.
mm.
So I'm all for that.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, that's quite interesting. Yeah. Recently, I was having a discussion with an elderly person from the my community, right, in Nagaland, and
Mhm.
our discussion went quite well. And one thing that really fascinated me was what he said about the our Nagas and our Nagas belief, right? Our belief system and basically the religion. He kind of said that in our dialect we use the word mamanger. Mamanger is like a word where it's like if you literally translate in English, and it will come to mean unbeliever or something like that. So he said that the Nagas, or specifically the owls, we are kind of mamanga, is like the unbeliever or something like that. But then
Mm.
I mean, we will say that they were not unbeliever as such, because they had belief in God, or certain spirits, and all of those things. So I think here, how I see it is something like this here, that I for me, in my work, the belief system, the system of the Nagas belief system, I put it under the rubric of animism, right? I kind of analyze it through the rubric of animism. Now, when I say animism, it's like there are different forms of it, and the way Nagas practice it and believe it is also a kind of different form of it. So when I look at it, and previously when I talk about the temporal aspect of the reality that the Nagas believe in, it's also quite interesting that he kind of said something like this here. He said that we Nagas, or specifically the owls, we didn't have an honor, or like the greatest god, right? Something like that. We didn't have that one. We had smaller gods, right? But then we didn't have the greater god. So he said that when the missionaries came, the greater god came. He said something like that, right? The greater God came. So obviously, we all had an honor that time. We knew who the greater God was. That was Jesus Christ, right? Which was there in the Bible, which was brought by the missionary. So people readily believed in that one. So we had this greater God, or greater being. So when you were also kind of mentioning about the you say that when Christianity came, and Christianity was contrasted with the traditional practices and beliefs and understanding of the reality itself. It was contrasted, and then it totally shifted people's understanding and way of living and all. And you were also saying that in today's, in your study, you study Christ in relation to economics, in relation to everyday beliefs and practices. And also, in your understanding, and as you went through your research field, and as you meet people, and as you have observed the ground reality, uh, what are the things that you think that positive and negative aspect that has changed among the Nagas with the coming of Christianity, and then by Christianity I mean the certain specific understanding of Christ, right? The God, a different understanding of Christ, God, or a different worldview that has come about. What are some of the important aspects that you think is positive, has positively changed, or let's say certain aspects that are negative or something like that that you observe?
So I think in terms of value judgment, it's quite personal, because I mean it's very individual, right? Based on what you think is good and bad for the society. So I think speaking as a Christian, and going with some of the things that I'm observing from interviews. Of course, my research has been primarily from Christians who think like me as well. So I agree with their observation in that, as you mentioned, pre-Christian, we lived in a world populated with spirits, and they were territorial spirits. I'm using the word spirits, but it's not the best word, but I'm just using it for now. Extra human entities, or whatever you call it, and these are like these populate places, specific places, right? Like there's uh, a specific being in the river, in that tree, and so we live with this in a world that's filled with these entities. And one of the uh, pervasive theme is that they lived in fear. This is agreed by everyone. Like in the pre-Christian world, they lived in fear. They lived in the arbitrary activities of the gods. Like the gods would terrorize them. The gods would inflict disease on them, and human beings simply have to manage that by sacrificing animals or doing rituals, and sometimes that would run them to poverty, extreme poverty, because they have to keep sacrificing. And so when Christianity came, most of these almost all of the people agree that Christianity brought about a liberation from living in fear, fear of the spirits. The sacrificial system was getting oppressive for them, and it was the source of their poverty, so on and so forth. And Christianity came, and there was no more need for rituals. There's no more need for incurring debts by sacrificing, by borrowing money for debt, for rituals, so on and so forth, right? So there's a sense of liberation that came with that, and of course that's the first generation of Christians. But I think one of the things that Christianity came with was education, and I think that is definitely one thing that has been good for me personally, and in my own personal belief, has been good for our people. It has brought us on an interface with other people, in which we can learn ideas, we can see what other people are doing, we can learn from them, we can borrow ideas from one another. We can we're in a position where we can even show people how we can do things, and it is education that brings us in a not necessarily an equal level, but in a level that we can communicate with one another, right? So I'm not saying that education made us like better or anything, which in a way it does, but I think more importantly, it brings us together, brings people together. Negative wise, I think I can keep talking on about the positives, but let's talk about the negative. I think one of the I guess tragedy is that there was as, an opinion of complete rejection of tradition and culture with Christianity, and I think that has been terrible for our people. And one thing that I'm still not able to pinpoint, but I'm finding very problematic, is this certain vision of progress and development that is often associated with Christianity. That amounts to like loving the West, loving others so much, gaping the West, gaping other people. We literally for Westerners, we literally call sabramai, means sahib people. We still have those words and those imaginations that still affect the way we look at the West. And I see that again, like I said, I'm not able to pinpoint how the connection is, but there is a deep connection with that kind of mentality and Christianity. And I'm still trying to understand why the connection is still there and how we can get rid of that. For as a point in that, why is it that Nagas are so fixated on Donald Trump and the elections in America, like, and why they're so fixated on evangelical Christianity in America, as if that's something happening in our backyard? It's none of our. In a way, it is our business, but it's also none of our business to be so invested in what's going on there. But for some reason, Christianity and that gaping of the West is tied together, and I feel that's a very, very unfortunate thing that has happened, and we are stuck with that for now. I think we must find some ways to understand what is going on there. And so these are, I guess, 2 points that I can bring out the negative of Christianity.
Yeah, I think the point that you have mentioned now is something which I also personally really see clearly in my work myself, right? I think the kind of similar questions I've asked the similar question to many church leaders as to telling them why the Christianity that we have among the Nagas are very much aided towards the West and especially the evangelical form of it. And I think these are some areas that I think you are exploring from a theological point of view, and I'm exploring I'm exploring this question as an anthropologist. And I think later on, I think the people can also think about it, but I think we can also sit and then really do certain discussion, good discussion on it, right? But then I think coming to a closing, my, one last question, and my last question is this one. It's something like this where you as a researcher, you say that you're working on Christological understanding, and you are trying to look at the grassroots community, and you are trying to relate how it affects the economy and the social life and the political life and all of those aspects. So I mean, 2 points in one question. First one is this one where uh, tell me the importance of your research work. I mean, why is your research work important? I mean, theologically, right? And the second one is, uh, what can I, as an anthropologist, right, who is not a theologian, anthropologist working on the Nagas and looking at Christianity itself, what can I learn from the kind of research that you, as a theologian, you're doing, right? So it's kind of like the interdisciplinary thing, right? How can I, as an anthropologist, learn from you as a theologian, and what is the importance of your research work as such for the community that you are working on? Yeah, so I think that'll be my closing question, and which I feel is very important. Yeah.
I think my question is important, at least for me, because it's part of my. I think it's all connected to what we've been talking. How shall I put it? Let's call it the new way of thinking about theology. At least new for me, because generally we would think of theology as something that you do in a room and with books and theologizing in abstraction, in intellectual pursuits and so on and so forth. My sense of understanding is that among the Nagas, on a superficial level, we look at our Christianity and we might say, they have no theology, they have no depth. But if you look closer, there's a lot of depth in the way Christianity is practiced, right? There's a lot of depth in their understanding of Christ, because it's not necessarily articulated. If you ask them to define who is Christ, they may not be able to define it for you. But if you look at the way Christology is embedded in their practices and lived out in their practices or in their rituals, in their events, I think there's a lot of Christology that's weaved into the life of the Naga people. And so as a theological pursuit, I'm looking at that and I'm trying to understand what is it that's embedded in the activities, in the songs, in the prayers, in the sermons, and trying to bring them out and sort of as an exercise for myself as well, but hopefully hoping that it will benefit everybody else as well, that this is how Nagas do theology. This is how we theologize, not in books, not in texts and creeds, but in terms of practices, in terms of our Christmas festivities even. So that's the very broad, ambitious attempt that I'm doing. And I think as a theological practice, I think that's the way to go as we think about theology, especially in the majority world, where the priorities are not so much on abstraction and intellectual stuff, but it's more on lived and practiced Christianities. So that's I guess that's the first point. The second point: what can anthropologists learn or benefit from this? I think I would say that some of my most favorite books by anthropologists have been books that take theology seriously, and I really do appreciate work, anthropology of Christianity, which is, as you might be aware, a new genre that's emerging. Anthropologists who go into theology and try to understand, not as a theologian, but to understand the people. Because as we talked about reductionist reading, you can look at a people and you can say, I'm not a theologian, I will not touch the theological aspect. But for Christians, or for that matter, for any person who is practicing a belief, beliefs are very important, right? I think you would agree with me in that. And if we want to understand a particular people, we have to understand their beliefs as well. We have to understand their theology as well. And so I think if we neglect the theology aspect in an anthropological program, I think that would be taking away a huge chunk of important resource to understand a particular group of people. I don't know if that makes sense, but I mean that's what comes to your mind immediately when you ask the question.
For me, when I look at it, right, as the discipline goes, I think Joel Robbins also have kind of written something on what can anthropologists, or the dividing line between the anthropology and theology, where he kind of lamented on the fact that there are certain aspects, and which Peter Berger also says, that anthropology is a discipline which is like methodologically atheistic, something like that, right? Lamented on those aspects. And I think this is an important question that has been going on discussing in the field of anthropology, where the anthropologists are kind of like apathetic towards certain the very question of God, right? They are kind of apathetic towards the question of God. So I think as an anthropologist, I think it's, for me, I believe it's high time, or let's say it's time. I'm sure people are already doing it, but then I think it's already a very high time, and it's time to really look at a discipline like theology, and try to clean something from it, and not to be apathetic towards people's view and understanding of God. Because I think for me as an anthropologist, the important question for me, as such, when I do research on the religious community, is not whether the kind of God that they believe is true or not. No, I mean that is not my question. I think the most important question is, yes, they have a belief in God, and that God, or whatever things that they believe in, is very true for them. And when I do research, I need to understand that the people or community that I'm doing researching, is that whatever they believe is true for them, and not to be apathetic towards whatever they believe, right? And not to come from a methodological standpoint and say that, okay, these things are useless or something like that. But I think there are certain aspects that they take it to be very true and very essential to who they are, and what they practice, and what they believe, and how they live their life, and which is something which this is something which theologians study, and theologians debate and talk about, and which I also can glean and learn from as an anthropologist. Even though I myself, I'm not concerned about whether that God exists or not, but I think since my concern is about their social activities and behavior and everyday lived activity, so I think that is where theology can really aid in my understanding, or in my understanding, where I can really go deep into the people's own mind, right? People's own understanding of certain concepts and certain ideas and certain things, which I, as an anthropologist, will not be able to understand as such from my discipline itself, because there are certain words which have a different meaning when put in certain contexts, which theologians study and do certain things. So I think in that way, I think it is theology as a discipline of study is very helpful, and I think even in anthropology circle, this discussion has been going on over a certain few years now, and I think
Yeah.
it is developing really well. Actually, I can really see that in anthropology, in anthropology and theology is really developing very well. So I think the future of the interdisciplinary dialogue between anthropology and theology is looking good. I mean, I should say, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.